said before, Richard is actually a Civil War historian, is probably the right term. And he's the author of John B. Slough, The Forgotten Civil War General, which is an interesting book if you want to read some more about history. He's given this presentation before in Maple Valley, and we kind of rushed him in, and it was a bunch of Cherokee that became his audience. It was a great surprise for us to have someone presenting Cherokee history here in Washington that isn't Cherokee. And I'm betting it was an equal surprise to him that we all arrived. He's been kind enough to repeat his presentation with a little bit of buffing, and I promise not to shortcut some of his answers because we're recording this obviously so other people can learn from this. And not everyone is had the opportunities to review this information as we have in the past. So Richard, thank you again for coming to do this.
Thank you.
Appreciate this.
You bet. You bet. So is this a good place to stand?
Well, like I said, once we go to your presentation,
Yeah, doesn't make any difference.
we'll make it even different. So our microphone is also, this is our microphone.
Okay, so go ahead and why don't you just go put the slideshow on and get started.
Perfect.
There we go. Great. Yeah. Well, thank you, Joseph. Thank you for this invitation to spend this afternoon with you. And thank you for an opportunity for me to talk about a Cherokee tragedy that, frankly, I think rivals the sorrows of Trail of Tears. So for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to share with you the story of the Cherokee Nation during the American Civil War, a war that devastated the Cherokee people. Now consider these facts. Before the Civil War, late 1850s, the Cherokee Nation was the most powerful and prosperous of all of the 5 nations. In fact, quite possibly the most powerful and prosperous of all the tribes in North America. By the late 1850s, Cherokee ranchers and farmers successfully raised herds and crops that went up across the Cherokee Nation, which would eventually become the state of Oklahoma. Mechanized reapers, mowers, and harvesters were commonly used on farms that could encompass as much as 1,000 acres. Meanwhile, hundreds of Cherokee entrepreneurs ran commercial businesses in the towns and hamlets across their homeland. Population in the Cherokee Nation had grown to 22,000 people by the late 1850s, including 4,000 enslaved African Americans. The nation's.
Please let me know when you want to slide change.
Oh, yeah, I do actually. Thank you. I'm off and running. The nation's capital, Tahlequah, impressed visitors with its government buildings, its streets lined with well-built homes, and its thriving commercial district. And the nation's principal chief, John Ross, resided in a stately mansion called Rose Cottage in the town of Park Hill. By the end of the Civil War, both Ross's mansion in Park Hill and the council house in Tahlequah had been burned to the ground. Vast stretches of the Cherokee Nation were depopulated, with farms and ranches abandoned. Rustlers, including soldiers sanctioned by both the Union and Confederate armies, had stolen more than 300,000 head of Cherokee cattle. Schools, churches, and businesses were forced to shut down during the war, leading to the disintegration of the Cherokee social fabric. By the end of the war, 7,000 Cherokees roamed their nation searching for food or subsisting on handouts outside the federal forts. 1/3 of Cherokee women were widows, and more than 1/4 of Cherokee children were orphans. By 1867, the population of the Cherokee Nation had shrunk to 13,550 people. That is a 30% decline since the height of 22,000 people in the late 1850s. Regular Army units from both the North and South contributed to this devastation. Confederate troops from Arkansas and Texas battled Union forces from Kansas, Colorado, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Iowa in a series of engagements in Indian Territory. Now, looking at a map of the territory, you can see why both the Confederate and the United States governments were willing to commit troops to this remote theater of war. The South had been nervous that if Union troops controlled Indian Territory, both Arkansas and Texas would be at risk for invasion. And similarly, the North had to be concerned that Confederate forces from Texas and Arkansas would move through Indian Territory up into Kansas. Not only would the loyal state of Kansas be at risk for rebel depredations, the federal government also wanted to protect the routes crossing Kansas to the gold fields of Colorado and to Santa Fe. So whether coming from the North or the South, opposing armies would have to transfer across the Cherokee Nation. Now, fighting alongside both Confederate and Union regular Army units were regiments organized from within Indian Territory. Now, at the Battle of Honey Springs, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, there were regiments from Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations that fought for the Confederacy. And on the Union side of Honey Springs were the 1st and 2nd Indian Home Guards, comprised of men from the Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, and other tribes. Along with numerous set-piece battles, this intratribal warfare and intertribal warfare led to unrelenting partisan conflict, much like bleeding Kansas in the 1850s, and contributed to the desolation of Indian Territory. Now, federal rivalries among elements of the Cherokee people dated back to the early 1900s. At that time, the Cherokee Nation spread across parts of Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, and North Carolina. Encroachment on these lands by white people had become increasingly problematic by the 1820s. As early as 1822, so much Cherokee land in Tennessee had been lost to whites that more than 6,000 Cherokees had been forced to move from Tennessee to northern Georgia. Cherokees in Georgia were able to fend off white advances for most of the 1820s, but in 1829, gold was discovered in northern Georgia. As historian John Sedgwick writes in Blood Nation, once the gold appeared, the Cherokee Hills of northern Georgia no longer belonged to Cherokee. They belonged to just about anyone with a shovel. Efforts by both individuals and the Georgian state government to displace the Cherokee population became relentless. Alabama, Tennessee, and North Carolina soon followed Georgia's efforts to displace, to grab Cherokee land. Now, to prevent Cherokees from selling their own land, especially to whites, the Cherokee Council passed a law in October 1829 that said, quote, if any citizen or citizens of this nation should treat and dispose of any land belonging to this nation without special permission of the national authorities, he or they will suffer. This blood law would have tragic consequences for the Cherokee people lasting in the 20th century. Now, what's interesting about the blood law is that it was drafted by John Ridge, the son of a powerful and respected Cherokee leader, Major Ridge. Major Ridge and John Ridge both believed that accommodation with the whites was unavoidable. They believed that allying with the United States government would yield the best chance for maintaining a strong, unified Cherokee Nation. Opposed to the Ridges was John Ross, the Cherokee's principal chief. Ross took the path of resistance to accommodation, believing that the United States government would uphold Cherokee rights. When John Madison in the Supreme Court failed to recognize the Cherokees as a sovereign nation with rights over their own lands, Ross believed that whoever was elected president after Andrew Jackson would come to the Cherokees' aid. He was wrong. As the power struggle between the Ross faction and the Ridge faction deteriorated into outright hatred, Major Ridge, his son John, and other leaders of the Ridge faction decided to take the future of the Cherokee Nation into their own hands. In 1835, some 20 members of the Ridge faction, signed the Treaty of New Echota, which ceded the Cherokee homelands in the southeast of the United States in exchange for a new homeland in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. 11 years of hardship, bloodshed, death for the Cherokee Nation began with the Treaty of New Echota. Members of the Ridge Party, led by Stan Wady, and you'll hear a lot more about Stan Wady as I talk, left for Indian Territory shortly after the treaty was signed. They arrived there in December 1835 and quickly sought to ally themselves with the old settlers, Cherokees, who had emigrated to Arkansas in the very early 1800s. Ross, his followers, refused to leave their traditional homeland. Forcibly removed by the United States government in 1838, this group embarked upon the infamous Trail of Tears. About 4,000 John Ross's followers died while walking the Trail of Tears. Ross's wife was among them. Now, I need to point out that the Cherokees were not alone in the extreme hardship occasioned by removal. Other tribes, the Creeks, Seminoles, Chickasaws, and Choctaws, also lost thousands of members either during their war with the United States government to retain their lands or during their subsequent forced removal. Tragic events set in motion when the Ridge faction signed the Treaty of New Echota did not end with the Cherokees' arrival in Indian Territory. Considered traitors for signing the New Echota Treaty and breaking the blood law by ceding Cherokee land, Major Ridge and his son John, the author of the blood law, were assassinated in June 1839. Chief John Ross denied involvement, that the killings set off a bloody intratribal feud between the Ross and Ridge factions that lasted for years and would be revisited again 20 years later during the Civil War. Stan Wady, who became head of the Ridge faction on the deaths of Major Ridge and John Ridge, lost two brothers, Elias and Thomas, and a close friend, James Starr, for the fight. Wady himself stood trial for the murder of one of the suspected assassins of his uncle, Major Ridge, but was acquitted on the grounds of self-defense. The intratribal bloodletting ended with the signing of the Treaty of 1846, almost a decade later. The ensuing peace enabled the Cherokee Nation to rebuild. As I said at the beginning of this talk, by the eve of the Civil War, the Cherokees were one of the most prosperous and powerful tribes in North America. But unfortunately, fractures still existed within the Cherokees that would pull the nation apart in 1861. Racial divisions existed between mixed blood and full-blood Cherokees. There were economic divisions between slaveholding and non-slaveholding Cherokees. Religious divisions existed between members of pro-slavery and abolitionist Protestant denominations in the Cherokee Nation. And underneath these fractures The bad blood between the in-power Ross faction and the out-of-power Ridge faction, led by Stan Wadey, still poisoned the nation. The rift between the northern and southern states reopened all the wounds experienced during the tribal warfare of the 1830s and 1840s. Mixed blood and pro-slavery Cherokees of the Ridge faction sided with the Confederacy, while full-blooded, non-slave-holding Cherokees within the Ross faction tended to remain loyal to the Union. This division would prove disastrous to the tribe. When the Civil War broke out, the Confederacy moved quickly to ally with the Five Nations: Creeks, Seminoles, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Cherokees. By summer 1861, Richmond had sent 3 representatives: Bureau of Indian Affairs Commissioner David Hubbard, Brigadier General Ben McCulloch, and Arkansas lawyer Albert Pike, to secure treaties with the five tribes. The Confederacy offered them rights that the federal government had never considered, such as the right to send representatives to Richmond to participate in the Confederate Congress. More important, the Confederate commissioners promised to protect existing five-nation investments in Southern state annuities, in Southern state bonds, with guaranteed payment of future annuities. Meanwhile, the federal government made no effort to retain the loyalty of the tribes within the Indian territory. Indeed, relations between the federal government and the five nations significantly deteriorated with the onset of the Civil War. Washington had to recall its troops from the Western forts, leaving the five tribes without protection from their enemies. To make matters worse, the Lincoln administration feared that the annual annuity payments due to the tribes might fall into rebel hands while being shipped to Indian territory. The government's solution: stop the payments altogether, push tribal governments into bankruptcy. By August 1861, 4 of the 5 tribes had signed treaties with the Confederacy. Only the Cherokees remained neutral. Chief John Ross understood the threat the Civil War posed to the fragile peace among his people. Declaring for the Confederacy would imperil Cherokees to remain loyal to the Union, while aligning with the North would anger pro-Southern tribes. So Ross attempted to remain neutral until Confederate General Ben McCulloch authorized Ross's nemesis, Stan Wadey, to recruit a battalion of Cherokee soldiers for the Confederacy. Ross's hand was now forced. He could not turn to them who had not authorized him to arm his followers. He could only align with the Confederacy, raise his own troops under Richmond's auspices, and counter the real threat to his power that Wadey posed with his opponent. On August 21st, 1861, the Cherokee Nation held the Grand Council in Tahlequah to discuss the question of neutrality. Ross capitulated to the pressure posed by Wadey's battalion and advocated for a treaty with Richmond. The chief very pragmatically had decided that an alliance with the Confederacy had become necessary if he wanted to remain in power, indeed if he wanted to remain alive. 2 months later, the Cherokee Executive Council voted to raise 1 regiment to be recruited by Ross's nephew, John Drew, nominally loyal to the Confederacy, but actually loyal to John Ross. The council also authorized Stan Wadey to bring his battalion up to full regimental strength. Now, like a Shakespearean tragedy, we can tell the history of the Cherokees during the Civil War in 5 acts. The first act ends with Chief John Ross, his hand forced by the troops commanded by Stan Wadey, abandoning his neutrality in August 1861. His decision to sign a treaty with Richmond set in motion the tragic forces that will unfold over the next 4 acts, or more conveniently, the next 4 years. Act 2 begins in the Creek Nation. On August 5th, 1861, the Loyal Creeks, that is, the pro-Union Creeks, declared invalid the treaty signed between the Creek Nation and the Confederacy. Oglethorpe, an influential full-blooded Creek, organized the pro-Union resistance in the Creek Nation. November 1861, Confederate Colonel Douglas Cooper, commander of Confederate forces in Indian Territory, set out with 1,500 men to subdue Oglethorpe and to exert Confederate control over Indian Territory. Eventually, 7,600 Creeks, Seminoles, and members of other tribes, as well as several hundred free and recently enslaved blacks, banded together under Oglethorpe's leadership to make their way into Cherokee Nation. The Creek leader hoped that federal troops stationed in Kansas would come to their aid and protection, but the federal forces never arrived. For a while, Oglethorpe's men were able to elude Douglas's pursuit, even resorting to the tactic of burning the prairie to slow down the pursuing Confederate cavalry. But eventually, depletion of their horses and provisions slowed Oglethorpe's band, and on December 25th, 1861, the Loyal Indians were forced to take shelter on a bluff overlooking Shoal Creek near present-day Skiatook, Oklahoma. Now, 3 days earlier, on December 22nd, Colonel James McIntosh, with almost 1,400 infantry and cavalry from Texas and Arkansas, left for Fort Gibson to join with Cooper's 1,500 soldiers. McIntosh caught up with Oglethorpe's people at Shoal Creek, or Chestinala, and decided to attack without waiting for Cooper's men. Oglethorpe's men, about 1,700 defenders of the band, were in the brush and slope overlooking the creek. McIntosh sent the 11th Texas, the 6th Texas, and the 3rd Texas regiments up the rugged slope to attack the creek's flanks and center. Oglethorpe's men fought the attacking Texans for 4 hours, delaying the rebels so that the women and children could escape. But the Confederates steadily pushed the Loyal Indians back to the camp, where the retreat turned into a rout. And waiting for the fleeing pro-Union Indians were Stan Wady, 300 Cherokees, proceeded to kill men, women, and children indiscriminately. Oglethorpe's band struggled into Kansas on what would become known as the Trail of Blood on Ice. Without adequate food or clothing, the band spent the winter of 1861-1862 near Fort Road, Kansas. While there, some 2,000 Loyal Creeks, Seminoles, Cherokees, and other tribes died of exposure and illness. Oglethorpe was among those who died that following winter. Our third act begins in early 1862. The loyal resistance in Indian Territory had been crushed, and thousands of refugees were struggling to survive the bitter winter in Kansas. Confederate forces, with their native allies, controlled Indian Territory, and pro-Union Cherokees, Creek, Seminoles, and other tribal members had little hope of ever returning to their homes. How quickly the tides of war can change. After the Confederate defeat at Pea Ridge on March 7th, 1862, Earl Van Doren's Confederate Army of the West was ordered east to Mississippi to support Albert Sidney Johnston's army. By mid-April 1862, most of the rebel forces, including the Arkansas and Texas troops in Indian Territory, had left the region. The Union command now saw their opportunity to establish federal control of land south of Kansas. Union Colonel William Weir, with 6,000 men, including 1,600 Native American soldiers, entered the Cherokee Nation on June 28, 1862. The troops were followed by 1,500 pro-Union Cherokee refugees returning to the homes that they had left when the Cherokee leadership voted to align with the South back in August 1861. Facing Winter's troops were two Cherokee regiments and a small contingent of white Confederate infantry. The rebel Cherokee regiments had returned from the Battle of Pea Ridge and Terrible Ridge and were still serving without pay for the arms, ammunition, and supplies that the Confederate government had promised them back in the heydays of treaty. Meanwhile, the men of John Drew's regiments were deserting roads to the Union side. You'll recall that the Cherokee Executive Council had authorized Drew to raise a regiment back in October 1861. And most of the men of Drew's mounted rifles had enlisted out of loyalty to John Ross, not out of loyalty to Sam Wadey or to the Confederacy. By July 1862, some 600 soldiers from Drew's regiment had deserted. Another 200 to 300 members of Drew's regiment were at Park Hill, guarding Chief John Ross and his family. These soldiers also deserted on July 15, when Captain Harrison Greeno, and a company of the 6th Kansas Cavalry, entered Park Hill unopposed and placed Chief John Ross under arrest. Now, Ross was probably relieved not to have to order his people to attack the invading federal forces. He surrendered to Captain Greeno, left Park Hill under arrest, and spent the remainder of the war in exile in Philadelphia. Ross's lawful, initially neutral, then aligned with the Confederacy, and finally voluntarily leaving Indian Territory under federal guard, dissolved the Cherokee Nation in two irreconciled halves. In February 1863, Major Thomas Pegg was elected president of the pro-Union Cherokee Council and served as leader of the Ross faction. 1 month later, in March 1863, the Confederate Cherokees elected Stan Wadey as their chief. During this time, bands of pro-Union and pro-Confederate Cherokees ravaged the countryside, laying waste to farms and ranches. The intratribal warfare experienced during the 1830s and 1840s reappeared as opposing factions sought revenge on their enemies. The Cherokee Nation became a hotbed of outlaws, renegades, and vigilantes. Meanwhile, the Union troops under Colonel Weir provided no protection to the Cherokees. In fact, Weir's subordinate, Colonel Frederick Solomon, arrested Weir on charges of drunkenness, abuse of fellow officers, and dereliction of duty. Afraid that the federal column was overexposed or overextended and exposed to attack, Solomon inexplicably ordered his troops back to Kansas just a few weeks after they had entered Indian Territory. With them went the 1,500 pro-Union Cherokee refugees, but hopes dashed they would be able to return to their homes. More than any other of the 5 nations, the Cherokee Nation suffered the brunt of the fighting between Union and Confederate forces during the first half of 1863. On January 8, 1863, Richmond gave command of the Department of Indian Territory to Brigadier General William Steele. Steele that the Arkansas River formed the best line of defense for Confederate forces in the region. This is a bit hard to see on the slide, but you might be able to see it right above the label Indian Territory. The Arkansas River is flowing southeast to northwest. And that's the very bottom of Cherokee Nation. So Steele believed that really was the best line of defense for the troops in Indian Territory. He thought that if the rebel defenders couldn't hold that line, and they were forced south of the river, essentially out of the Cherokee Nation, he worried that the next line of defense would have to be the Red River, which would be on the very border of Texas. So to avoid that possibility, Steele determined to strengthen the Confederate military presence along the Arkansas River with reinforcements from Texas. Unfortunately for Steele and his plans, the Richmond government could not supply Confederate troops in the Trans-Mississippi, as Union controlled the Mississippi River corridor throughout 1863. Steele could not supply his men. Steele could not replace any artillery that had been lost either from hard wear or from battle. And worse, he had to rely on inferior Mexican gunpowder brought up to Texas. Now, opposing Steele was Brigadier General James G. Blunt, a pre-war abolitionist who commanded the Federal Department of Kansas. Now, Blunt is no hero in a tragedy. Quint Crow, in his book about the Civil War and the Indian Nation, was a thorough job exposing Blunt's schemes to grow rich on fraudulent army contracts. But to his credit, Blunt was an aggressive and effective commander, far more than his Confederate counterparts in the Trans-Mississippi. So our fourth act begins in early July 1863, just as Ulysses S. Grant's Army of the Tennessee captured Vicksburg and effectively split the Trans-Mississippi from the rest of the Confederacy. Steele planned to reinforce Brigadier General Douglas Cooper's army south of the Arkansas River in anticipation of attacking the federal troops at Fort Gibson. James Blunt had no intention of allowing the rebels to go on the offensive. 10 days after learning that Confederate troops were converging opposite Fort Gibson, he began to ferry his troops across the flooded Arkansas River. By the night of July 16, the federal force had crossed the river and begun their march to the Confederate position. The next morning, 10 a.m., after just 2 hours rest, Blunt ordered his men to form a battle line in preparation for attacking Cooper's rebels. Now, I believe that the Union and Confederate forces, what would be known as the Battle of Honey Springs, were the most racially diverse forces in the entire Civil War. On the Union right was the 3rd Wisconsin Cavalry, white, and the 2nd Indian Home Guard Regiment, mainly composed of loyal Cherokees. In the center were the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry and the 2nd Colorado. And on the left were the 1st Indian Home Guard Regiment, mostly composed of Loyal Creeks, and the 6th Kansas Cavalry. On the opposite side, Cooper placed his Cherokee troops on the right, his Creek troops on the left, and anchored his center with elements from 3 Texas cavalry regiments. The Battle of Honey Springs began with an unequal artillery duel between Blunt's heavier pieces and Cooper's lighter one. After several minutes of cannon fire, Blunt ordered his line forward to within 40 paces of the Confederate defenders. Cooper unsuccessfully tried to flank the Union right, while Blunt hammered at the Confederate center. For 2 hours of steady fighting, the Confederate center began to break under the onslaught of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. As the Federal soldiers pressed their advantage, the remainder of the Confederate line gave way, attempted to reform, gave way again, and retreated. Confederate Colonel Cooper reported losing 134 killed and wounded during the 2-hour fight. But Blunt claimed that his men buried 150 rebels on the field. According to Blunt, only 13 men from the Union command were killed. Now, historian Crow speculates that Union losses were insignificant during 2 hours of heavy fighting because the inferior Mexican powder used by the rebels simply packed their punch. The Union victory Honey Springs on July 17, 1863, essentially any organized Confederate presence in Indian Territory. Fighting there did not stop with the Confederate withdrawal, but was mainly limited to partisan warfare and the harassment of Union wagon trains and patrol. Pro-Southern Cherokees and Creeks fled to refugee camps along the Red River, just as pro-Northern Cherokees and Creeks had fled north to Kansas in 1861. Territory was now largely depopulated. Its productive farms and ranches barren, its towns empty. Those families who remained behind in Cherokee territory had to hide their teenage sons from being drafted or killed by the bushwhackers who terrorized the region. Some Native mothers even died while trying to protect their children. During the winter of 1863-1864, thousands of Cherokees tramped across the frozen countryside looking for food. There was no livestock, no game, no flocks to feed the people. Hannah Wooster, the pro-Union daughter of a missionary of the Cherokees, worried that women and children would starve or promised tradeload of flour did not arrive. It seems all the time like one great funeral, she thought. But the tragedy of the Cherokee Nation was not yet finished. We still have to put hostilities in the Indian Territory ended on June 23, 1865, when General Stanley signed a ceasefire with Union representatives in Doaksville, Choctaw Nation. The federal government insisted that the five nations sign new treaties with the United States. September 8, 1865, at the Portsmouth Conference, Commissioner of Indian Affairs Dennis Cooley argued that the Cherokees had forfeited all pre-war rights, annuities, and protection because they had signed a treaty with the Confederacy. Through his representatives, John Ross countered that he had no option but to side, but Cooley rejected that argument. He required the Cherokees to agree to a permanent peace with the United States, to abolish slavery, and to cede all lands in the Cherokee Nation. The terms of the Portsmouth Conference were ratified by the United States Senate on July 27, 1866. John Ross died a few days later. Stan Wadey decided to leave Cherokee politics after the war to rebuild his family's ruined fortune. He died in 1871. The Cherokees elected a compromise candidate, Lewis Downing, as their principal chief in 1867. Unfortunately, our story doesn't end like a Shakespearean tragedy. No one hailed Lewis Downing as a new leader, like Macbeth hails Malcolm at the end of Macbeth. No one offered praises to slain, like Antony praises Julius Caesar at the end of the Julius Caesar. And no one pronounced the tragedy over. Downing was a capable leader who helped reconstruct the Cherokee Nation, but I think he died prematurely in 1872. And despite Downing's efforts, tensions between the Ross and Ridge factions existed for the rest of the 19th century and indeed into the 20th. Truly, the Civil War devastated the Cherokee people for long after Stan Wadey surrendered his command 2 months after. Thank you.